I'm Tom DeWeese, president of the American Policy Center. On September 7, 2000, as nearly every head of state and world leader gathered at the United Nations headquarters in New York City for a so-called Millennium Summit, the American Policy Center delivered more than 350,000 petitions to Capitol Hill calling for an end to United States involvement in the UN. APC's petitions were titled "A Declaration of Independence from the United Nations" and urged support of Congressman Ron Paul's bill entitled the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, H.R. 1146. Once enacted, H.R. 1146 would end U.S. membership in the UN, remove the U.S. from any and all UN programs, and send the United Nations headquarters from American shores. Using our Sledgehammer Action Alert system, APC then organized a national call-in to Congress, asking thousands of activists to call their representatives at exactly 12 noon on September 7th, again to urge members to support H.R. 1146 to get the United States out of the UN. Finally, at 9 a.m. on Thursday, September 7th, before the telephone calls began, the American Policy Center held a news conference in the Rayburn House office building located directly across the street from the U.S. Capitol. The APC news conference was aired on C-SPAN several times during the final days of the Millennium Summit and helped APC achieve its goal to expose the UN's agenda for global governance. More importantly, on September 7, 2000, the American Policy Center helped launch a renewed war against the United Nations as we rallied Americans from across the nation to stand for sovereignty.
Our first speaker is Congressman Ron Paul from the 14th District of Texas. Dr. Paul?
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here this morning. It's almost intimidating to look at these boxes and just wonder who's been writing letters. And I hope the members of Congress get the message. We're here today to talk a little bit about national sovereignty. I tell my people back home that I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe in the sovereignty of the United States, and that usually elicits great applause because they know that there's a lot of people up here that aren't much interested in American sovereignty. What they're talking about up here is how you cooperate in a globalist type of government. And I guess the best evidence for that is what we're frantically, as a Congress, doing right now to accommodate the World Trade Organization by changing our tax law, because we have until October 1st to change tax laws for the foreign corporation tax that they have ruled does not conform with the WTO. But this is an example to me on how we have sacrificed so much. I am not an isolationist. I believe in free and open trade and free travel, but I believe the way we spread our message is by example, but not by world government. Today we have a foreign policy that is driven by the United Nations. We put troops under UN command. NATO determines what we do. We have literally put our soldiers under command of foreign generals. This is very annoying and something that the American people do not support, and yet it continues. We have become the world policeman acting under a UN banner. We follow the tax laws, which is driven by world government, and actually we're in a welfare system through the World Bank. So we have three arms of the United Nations which we have capitulated to. The first, the International Monetary Fund, which is the financial arm of the globalist type government, and the welfare arm is the World Bank, and of course the management of trade is the World Trade Organization. Unlike others who claim they're for free trade, I do not like the managed trade through the World Trade Organization. This is literally managed trade because it sanctions tariffs and actually permits a trade war to go on, but not determined by the United States Congress. This is the reason that we have coalition building on many of these issues, not just conservative constitutionalists, but also people from the left who see this an attack. We may well disagree with what their solutions are to the problems of labor law and environmental law, but they're about as fed up with an international government dictating to us what environmental law and labor law should be. And this is the reason we literally see tens of thousands of people rallying in the streets today condemning this movement. And as the UN moves forward into this century, we who have been fighting this attempt to undermine our national sovereignty see this as a threat. We see this as a threat to our sovereignty, to our freedoms, to our principles, and therefore we are alarmed. Evidently, others are alarmed too. We see a lot of petitions here. Tom DeWeese from the American Policy Center has been working on this issue for a long time, and I compliment him for being able to galvanize the American people. I actually believe this is a small number of people that are concerned, and there will be a lot more, and this will be a growing number once the American people realize what's actually happening with our sacrifice. A lot of people complain about the sacrifice of our liberties from the local level to the federal level, that we get too many dictates from the federal government, that the EPA comes and tells us exactly what to do in our various states. But now we're going one level further, and we're having treaties that are designed by internationalists, the Kyoto Treaty that will come in and dictate to the United States the particular laws. So it's not that we reject the ideas that we should deal with these problems, and it's not that we believe that we should not have trade with other nations, it's that we reject the notion that the American citizens should give up their freedoms and their sovereignty to some international government organization. So I welcome all of you here today, and am very pleased that I can participate in this event.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Our next speaker is Representative Helen Chenoweth-Hage from Idaho. After Mrs. Hage speaks, then we can have questions to the two members of the House. Mrs. Hage?
It's a privilege and a pleasure to join Dr. Paul today here at this press conference on this most important issue. In 1943, my Uncle Merlin raised his right hand and swore the following oath. He said, "I, Merlin Ward, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me according to regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So help me God." Well, 1 year later, my uncle gave his life to keep that oath, and while it grieved us terribly, and does to this day, we knew that his sacrifice had real meaning. We knew that he had given his life so that we, his family, and his countrymen would be free. Well, today's servicemen swear exactly the same oath, and lately many of them have found themselves in a terrible catch-22. They are sworn to obey officers whose orders betray their oaths. They are ordered to obey foreign officers whose primary objective is not to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. It's been suggested that in order to avoid this contradiction, today's military oath would have to read something like this: "I do solemnly swear to offer my life and my liberty, to spend months apart from my family, missing anniversaries and birthdays and even the births of my children, in defense of globalism and the worldview put forward by the United States. I promise to obey unquestioningly the orders of whomever the members of the United Nations have voted to command me. I promise to stop believing America is the best nation on earth and worth dying for." This is not the path America should take. This is not the path we want to lead our military down. This is not the way to protect and defend the best we can those people those military men and women who swear the oath to protect and defend us. America is a nation so very special that free men and women volunteer their lives to defend it, and they always have. We must honor their sacrifice by keeping their promise, and we must keep their families free. I have introduced a bill entitled the Soldiers Protection Act, H.R. 4669, actually the Citizen Soldier Protection Act, This bill would protect the very patriotism and love of liberty that has led men and women over the centuries to give their lives. It would prohibit the involuntary assignment of United States Forest servicemen to foreign commands. It also would prohibit our armed forces from ordering servicemen to wear insignia or rank other than that of the United States of America. This very basic measure ensures that American servicemen remain American under American command, dedicated to the principles of American freedom, American democracy, offering their lives to ensure liberty and justice for their children and their grandchildren. That's our servicemen. This is the principle my Uncle Merlin died for, and it is the principle I have served this Congress for the last 6 years. It is the only principle any American should ever be asked to make the ultimate sacrifice for. This bill, of course, was inspired and prompted by the Michael New issue, where this very dedicated young man was asked to wear a UN patch above the American flag, and he refused to do so. And so the Citizens Soldier Protection Act has been dropped, and we will be working in the Congress to see its completion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Hage. Any questions for Dr. Paul or Mrs. Hage?
Mrs. Hage, the quick question is, during the Second World War, American troops were put under foreign command, most notably under Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery. How would this bill that you're currently proposing, would that be in any change?
That happened when we joined and formed the Allied forces. But we must prevent what happened in Mogadishu and various other places where our soldiers were placed under command of people they couldn't even understand. Orders were mixed up. Secretary Aspen was exceedingly concerned about this. And the fact is that during World War II, Americans served willingly in the Allied forces under the command of generals that they could understand. And never should a serviceman be asked ever to place a UN patch on his uniform above the American flag. Never. I also want to remind you of the Sovereignty Protection Act that has passed the House 3 times, dealing with the issues of the international heritage sites as well as the biodiversity sites. Although this has been a big issue to me, and I will be leaving the Congress after this particular year, I surely do hope, and I leave it to Dr. Paul to run that through next year, and we certainly do look for a hero in the Senate to run it through and put it on the next president's desk. Thank you.
Dr. Paul, that would be my next question, which is, while I understand both of you are House members, my question would be, what support do you have from the Senate, since the Senate is involved with handling foreign treaties?
I do not have any specific numbers or people who have introduced the same type of legislation over the Senate. I would say that our support there is much weaker than in the House. But of course, the House is more closely aligned with the people. They're closer to the people, and they're reflecting more of the people's views. But you're obviously correct that for a bill like mine, 1146, which would get us out of the United Nations, you'd have to have co-sponsors and a lot of support in the Senate for that to occur. And although I think our support is growing, and I think if you ask the American people, the large majority would agree with us that we certainly shouldn't have troops serving under UN command and taking our dictates from an international government. The majority probably are not with us in just flat out getting out of the UN. But I would say that no, time will tell. And I think our momentum compared to, we've never had a vote on getting out of the UN before. A lot of people have talked about it, but we've had a couple votes that essentially said, just get us out. It's not in our best interest. And yes, we get less than 100 votes. But that's major progress compared to the last 40 or 50 years of just putting up with it and complacently going along with one world government. So I think the bill, the 1146, and the efforts of Helen Chenoweth will continue. And I think it will build. I think there's going to be momentum. There is momentum. And I think what we're doing here today shows it.
Dr. Paul, I have written my senator from Nebraska, Senator Hagel, asking him to draw up a Senate bill, Senate Bill 1146, and he wrote back and said he supports the United Nations.
Yes. He's just a little slow behind, not quite up with the people yet.
Any other questions?
Bill Gibson from Pennsylvania. I was going to ask about the Bricker Amendment. When you study the history of the Bricker Amendment, I wondered if that has any bearing on this.
Yeah, well, Helen has a bill dealing with the Bricker Amendment. She'll take care of that one.
Well, I brought the Bricker Amendment back out and dusted it off and ran it out again. And yes, it would have a direct impact anytime anyone's constitutional rights are abridged under the Bricker Amendment. The Bricker Amendment simply states the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, rising above treaties and executive orders and executive agreements.
Do you know if it's true that that passed the Senate committee by a vote of 2-1 before it was vetoed by President Eisenhower, I think?
Well,
somebody in the White House vetoed it back about 40 years ago.
Well, I think it lost on the floor by just one vote of a supermajority vote, which was very sad.
Dr. Paul, Mrs. Chenoweth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a few additional speakers for you this morning. I'm going to change the order just a little bit since some questions were about legislation in particular. Herb Titus is going to be speaking next to you. He's the Senior Legal Advisor to the Liberty Study Committee. This morning on the table we released our report analysis, Mr. Titus's analysis on H.R. 1146, and attached to that report there is a release which I will read for you. The merits of the United Nations are debatable. However, what is not debatable is that there is no binding political or legal United Nations authority over the United States or the American people. Herbert W. Titus, Senior Legal Advisor to the Liberty Committee, makes an unimpeachable case for this conclusion, and we are here to present his analysis to the American people and their elected representatives. Mr. Titus?
Good morning. I hold in my hand two written documents. One is the Constitution of the United States, and the other is the United Nations Charter. And I am here to tell you that these two documents are thoroughly incompatible. There's only one of these documents that's legitimate, and that is the United States Constitution. The United Nations Charter is illegitimate. We are told that the United Nations Charter is a treaty. It is not. It is a constitution for an international civil order. It was designed that way, it's being implemented that way, and even as we are here today, we see that it is being expanded on the basis of what it was originally designed to do. Unlike a treaty, the United Nations Charter can be amended without it being submitted for ratification by the United States Senate. Like a constitution, it can be amended without the consent of all of the member nations of the United Nations. Unlike a treaty, it allows for new members to come into the United Nations without ratification by the appropriate constituted authorities with regard to those new members. Like a constitution, new states can be admitted to the United Nations without the consent of all the existing member nations. Unlike a treaty, it is not stated in the name of the governments of the member states. Rather, if you look at the preamble of the United Nations Charter, you will see that it was promulgated in the name of the peoples of the United Nations. just the same as the United States Constitution and its preamble, "We the people." But unlike the United States Constitution, the United Nations Charter has never been submitted to the people of the United States or the people of any other nation for ratification. That is why the United Nations Charter is illegitimate, because the Senate, which did ratify the United Nations Charter, has no authority to constitute a government for a new international order. That authority can only be exercised by the people of the nations. How does the United Nations Charter change the Constitution of the United States? Well, we don't have time this morning to talk about all of the changes, but I want to highlight three. First of all, the United Nations Charter, as it now stands, violates Article 1, Section 7 of the United States Constitution. Article 1, Section 7 says that all revenue-raising bills must originate in the House of Representatives. The revenue-raising bill for the United Nations originates in the General Assembly of the United Nations. They send us the bill. The only authority that Congress has is to decide whether to pay the money. They have no authority under the United Nations Charter to decide how much money should be raised. It violates that bedrock principle of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. It also violates the authority that the United Nations or the United States Constitution confers upon Congress and the President to conduct the foreign affairs of this nation. Indeed, it robs the United States of its right to defend itself according to the laws of nation, subordinating the national sovereignty of the United States to the collective security of the member nations. And finally, it takes away the domestic authority of the United States government and the states. Listen to this quote from Kofi Annan, which is in the Human Development Report of 2000. "Even though we are an organization of member states, the rights and ideals the United Nations exists to protect are those of the peoples. No government has the right to hide behind national sovereignty in order to violate the human rights or fundamental freedoms of its people." This is tantamount, ladies and gentlemen, to a declaration of war upon the United States of America, that if the United States of America does not conform its domestic policies to the ideals of the United Nations, then we will not respect your national borders. It's not that the United Nations Charter and the United Nations is wrong-headed. It is wrong-headed. It is because it's illegitimate, and it has no political and no legal currency in American politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Titus. We have three other speakers, and we will end. The third speaker will be Tom DeWeese of the American Policy Center, who's the host of this press conference. Our next speaker will be Henry Lamb. Mr. Lamb is the president of Sovereignty International. Mr. Lamb.
Thank you very much, Tom, especially for putting this together. The celebration that's going on in New York right now is presented to the world as the Millennium Summit, the largest collection of heads of state that the world has ever known. And indeed it is. The news report last night on ABC and the mainstream media said that this meeting was to set the agenda for the United Nations for the next century, in which objectives were put forth to reduce poverty, to save the world from global warming, and a bunch of other wonderful things. What was not reported is the rest of the recommendations contained in the Millennium Declaration. These recommendations have been evolving over the last 5 years, since the UN-funded Commission on Global Governance set forth in a 410-page report called Our Global Neighborhood precisely how the United Nations should be reformed to achieve global governance. What we are seeing today in New York is the unanimous, if you will, mandate by all the heads of state and the United Nations General Assembly to move forward with the implementation of this agenda for global governance. Now, the United Nations spokespeople will quickly say global governance is not world government. But you can call a rose anything that you wish, and it continues to smell the same. I like to make the distinction between global governance and world government as about the same difference that exists between date rape and rape. One begins with seduction. And when you hear words like values essential to international relations include management of worldwide economic and social development, I hear that the essential value of the United Nations is a centralized system of management of world trade and social development that we fought 2 wars to prevent. In America, we should be promoting the idea of free trade, individual achievement, entrepreneurship, private property rights, and individual freedom and national sovereignty. We are witnesses to perhaps the most important single event in the history of our country. Watching our leaders go to New York and endorse this concept of global governance, which is nothing more than centralized collectivism that we used to call socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Our next speaker is Cliff Kincaid. Mr. Kincaid is the president of America's Survival. Mr. Kincaid.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the members of Congress. Thank you especially to Tom DeWeese for organizing this event. Cuba's Stalinist dictator, Fidel Castro, is among friends at the United Nations, the main one being UN boss King Kofi Annan, who has achieved notoriety for having cut sleazy deals with anti-American dictators and tyrants such as Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. Thanks to Annan, Saddam is once again a threat to world peace, having reconstituted his weapons of mass destruction, and Gaddafi has escaped punishment in the Pan Am 103 terrorism trial. Annan, who likes to posture as a friend of humanity and enemy of war criminals, assured Gaddafi in a letter recently unveiled after a year's cover-up that the Pan Am trial would not, quote, undermine Gaddafi's regime. This spy-infested Hate America collection of tyrants, leftists, deadbeats, thieves, and frauds at the UN doesn't deserve another dime from the American taxpayers. But King Kofi's global governance agenda does amount to trillions of dollars. Cloaked in euphemisms, his official, quote, "We the People's" document includes calls for a standing army, global taxes, anti-American treaties, third world bailouts, disarming the American people, and an international criminal court to arrest and imprison American citizens. The UN, of course, has the big media on their side, including the Time Warner conglomerate, whose tag team duo of Gerald Levin and Ted Turner are working overtime to guarantee more favorable coverage for this anything but sacred cow. Levin, chairman of Time Warner, recently told the Aspen Institute that he thinks the UN ought to increase its power and promote itself as the enforcer of world peace. And the following week, just a coincidence I'm sure, Time magazine has Kofi Annan on its cover in a story saying his only sin is that he's too compassionate and that his moral vision for the world might be too bold. As for Time Warner chairman Ted Turner, The cozy alliance between this anti-Christian bigot and the UN and Annan personally is as sickening and disgusting as the idea that he could run a UN summit of religious leaders. But he seems right for the job, having insulted the Pope, having been close to Castro over the years, and having defended the butchers of Beijing for their massacre of freedom-loving students at Tiananmen Square. Perhaps Levin and Turner envision the UN as just another corporate subsidiary in their New World Order flowchart. But the big money cannot obscure the real truth, which is now becoming apparent even to a prominent liberal trial attorney like Richard Middleton of Atlanta, who is preparing an international lawsuit against the United Nations and Kofi Annan personally over their role in the Rwanda genocide of almost 1 million blacks. Try as he may, Kofi Annan can't wash the blood from his own hands when, as director of UN peacekeeping, he stood back and he allowed his fellow blacks in Africa to be literally hacked to death by a killing machine using machetes. For this, however, Annan got a promotion, and now as UN boss, his troops continue committing terrible atrocities in Sierra Leone. The American people should also remember that we have no real way of knowing exactly how much of our money is being wasted up there at the UN. American Linda Shenwick, a top budget analyst at the UN, was evicted from her job by the Clinton-Gore administration for telling Congress the truth about UN corruption. She is personally now deeply in debt, having been forced to spend thousands of dollars on legal bills trying to get justice in her case. Among other atrocities, Linda Shenwick has told us that the United Nations has known for years that UN peacekeepers were spreading the deadly disease AIDS to foreign countries, and in fact a new documentary on the matter says the UN literally brought AIDS to Cambodia. But it wasn't until this year that the world body officially acknowledged the problem and announced a laughable solution: a condom a day for UN peacekeepers. It is also strangely appropriate that while the UN delivers a death sentence to countless people around the world, Mary Robinson and the UN Commission on Human Rights wage a concerted campaign to overturn the death penalty here so that convicted killers might remain alive, watching color TV and getting law degrees in prison, all, of course, at American taxpayer expense. To add insult to injury, former UN boss and Nazi war criminal Kurt Waldheim continues to get a UN pension, $102,000 a year, partly paid for by American taxpayers. His portrait still hangs in the halls of UN headquarters in New York, where officials can cleanse their souls by having mystical experiences in the UN meditation room, coming into contact with the earth spirit Gaia, and then lecturing us Americans about the need for separation of church and state. On a closing note, we are going to have this statement and other materials on our own website, usasurvival.org, usasurvival.org, because sovereignty matters and national survival matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. Our final speaker is Tom DeWeese. Mr. DeWeese is the president of the American Policy Center and the host of this morning's press conference. After Mr. DeWeese's remarks, we'll have the 4 speakers come up to answer your questions. Mr. DeWeese.
Thanks, Ken. The American Policy Center is proud to present more than 300,000 petitions, about 1.5 tons in weight, in support of the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, H.R. 1146, introduced by Congressman Ron Paul. These petitions are in addition to the 250,000 APC delivered to the House last year, and more are coming in every day. Immediately following this event, these petitions will all be transferred over to Speaker Hastert's office, and I hope he reads every one of them. Our petition, the Declaration of Independence from the United Nations, has gained stronger reaction and support from Americans across the nation than any project ever undertaken by the American Policy Center. There is genuine concern among the American people for the future independence and security of our nation. Other organizations are finding the same level of opposition to the UN. Joining petitions from APC today are those from the Liberty Study Committee, about 50,000, American Survival, and the American Sovereignty Action Project. Still more are being gathered by other groups. In addition, we are joined here today by such organizations as Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum, by my good friend Howard Phillips, head of the Conservative Caucus and candidate for President of the United States, and by Catherine Ellis from the Free Congress Foundation. Clearly, opposition to the actions of the United Nations is growing across the nation. Also today, the American Policy Center is introducing its first annual National Sovereignty Vote Index. The index rates members of the House of Representatives according to their votes on 5 key pieces of legislation. They are H.R. 1146, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, the bill for which we are gathered today to build support. Last year, the bill was attached as an amendment to H.R. 1757, and our tallies were taken from that vote. The bill itself continues to await direct action. In committee, it has 18 co-sponsors. Amendment 844 to the bill H.R. 4276 was introduced by Congressman Roscoe Bartlett to strike funding for payment of the so-called arrearages and dues to the United Nations. In introducing his bill, Congressman Bartlett showed quite clearly that the United States does not owe any money to the UN, and that in fact the UN actually owes us a sustainable sum for peacekeeping expenses. House Joint Resolution 90, introduced by Representatives Paul and Metcalf, called for the withdrawal of the U.S. from the WTO. Both the 2 remaining bills, Amendment 412 to H.R. 2670 and the Amendment 306 to H.R. 2414, sought to eliminate or restrict U.S. funds for UN programs. These are the bills voted on in the 106th Congress that have had the strongest impact on U.S. national sovereignty. The index is nonpartisan. It is simply a report card on how Congress voted. A copy of the index is being delivered to every member of Congress today. The Senate version will follow. As we compiled this index, it was shocking to find out how many of our elected representatives who had sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States have failed to support even one of these bills. Fully 44% of the U.S. Congress scored a 0 on the national sovereignty test. We deliver the petitions and we prepare the National Sovereignty Index for one reason. Today, we are putting Congress on notice. There is a renewed fight in this nation to protect its future independence and sovereignty. The UN has changed its focus from a place where member nations can come to air their differences to a drive for centralized global power. Clearly, it is no longer your father's UN. However, nor are we any longer the type of foes the UN has grown accustomed to fighting. We represent thousands of Americans nationwide, located in every state. We have micro-researched every facet of the so-called restructuring of the United Nations. They call it global governance. We see it as little more than global socialism. Starting today, we will dig out and track down and get the word out on our own grapevine, radio call-in shows, fax networks, audio cassette, videotape, or any other jungle drum available. We will document legislation, translate diplo-speak, and hoard quotes from disingenuous politicians like a miser hoards his gold. And we will report to every congressional district how their representatives voted to protect national sovereignty. The United States is a different place from any other nation on earth. We have ideals and ideas of individual liberty, property rights, freedom of speech, freedom of travel, and our courts keep us free from unjust or political persecution. Many of these ideas are alien to those in the UN who seek to impose global governance. It is up to our elected representatives to protect those rights. And starting today, we intend to report to the nation on whether they do or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeWeese. Gentlemen, if you'll come forward, they'll be happy to answer your questions.
Gentlemen, this question is for all of you. Again, as I noted earlier with the congressmen that were here, where are the folks from the Senate who actually have the advice and consent rule under the U.S. Constitution? Not that I want to beat up on anybody, but let's face it, you have all the House support you want. If it's something that has to do with international treaties, you definitely need at least 51 votes in the Senate. Where are your Senate support?
Well, you're right. And as Congressman Paul said, the House is a place where we have closer touch with the people. But what the effort we're starting now, we will have a vote index for the Senate. We rushed to get it done today for the House just for this event, but the Senate one is coming. It's a process. There has been 40 years of a United Nations that's been looked upon in a favorable way. The average American person who knows the UN knows the television viewing of Adlai Stevenson sitting there fighting in the Middle East wars, and they know this is a place where the United States has fought a lot of battles for during the Cold War and so forth. But it's changing. The UN is changing, and so the debate is changing. And it'll take time to build that support, and it begins now. You're right. It'll be a while. It's not tomorrow, but it's coming.
I'd like to add that obviously our support in the Senate is in Jesse Helms' office. Jesse Helms has introduced a bill to protect American citizens from the International Criminal Court, but it's not limited to Jesse Helms' office. Senator Hagel was with us in Buenos Aires attending a UN climate change treaty meeting. He is very much opposed to the Kyoto Protocol now, as it now stands, and it is as it is likely to be. And there are other senators who are becoming aware of our concerns, although they are supportive in general of the United Nations objectives, as we are able to show them how the United Nations objectives is shifting from being a debating society among sovereign nations to a global governance. We expect their concern to grow.
Ma'am, do you have a question?
I think you are.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
A couple of questions. First of all, can we get copies of your remarks?
Mine are in the packet.
Okay, yours are in the packet and
No, I don't have any.
you don't have it. Okay.
Mine are outside.
And yours are outside, great. The second thing is, what surprises me is how rarely you find anything mentioned in the media about this issue. I have scanned newspapers across the country and other sources this week looking for any voice of concern about this Millennium Summit, and I have just not seen it. And having worked and been to these conferences of the UN, I know what you're speaking about, and I have been so surprised that there's just not even a whisper of a word about it.
One of the reasons that we held this event this morning, a few months ago when we realized there wasn't any coverage on what the UN itself calls the largest gathering it's ever put together, all the world's heads of state there, we decided that it was time to put a bright spotlight on what was going on there. And so this event is part of that effort. I understand that Fox News this weekend is going to run a program that touches on some of these things, and I think we see that changing too. I've been working on this issue for a number of years, and I have begun to see a change taking place. And so I think the more successful the UN is in implementing its programs, the more victims it creates, the more obvious that what we're saying is true becomes apparent, and it just takes time. But I think that you'll begin to see more of it.
Congratulations, good work. Appreciate it. God bless you.
Thank you.